They laughed at a widow with 4 kids at the town hall. But then she pulled out the deed to the ranch. The dust kicked up by Martha Calloway's worn boots settled on the wooden planks of the town hall steps as she paused. Her 4 children clustered behind her like young quail seeking shelter. The October wind carried the scent of coming winter across the Colorado territory, and Martha pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. They had traveled nearly 6 miles in their rickety wagon, the same wagon that now held everything they owned after spending the morning packing their few possessions under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Morrison, who had delivered the eviction notice with apologetic eyes but firm resolve. The children were tired and hungry. They had shared a single biscuit for breakfast, and Martha's stomach gnawed at her with each step. But she had promised them this morning that today would mark a new beginning, though she hadn't been entirely certain what she meant by those words until this very moment. Through the windows she could see the oil lamps casting dancing shadows on the faces of Millfield's most prominent citizens, the same men who had ignored her letters requesting an extension on her property taxes, the same men who had smiled politely at church while whispering about the burden she represented to their prosperous community. "Mama, maybe we shouldn't go in," whispered her eldest, Sarah, barely 16 but already carrying the weight of too much responsibility in her green eyes. "They don't want us here." Martha turned to face her children, Sarah, then 12-year-old Thomas with his father's stubborn jaw, 8-year-old Emma clutching her rag doll, and little James, just 5 and barely understanding why they had to leave their small cabin that morning with everything they owned packed into a single wagon. "We have every right to be here," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This meeting concerns the future of our valley, and we're part of this valley whether they like it or not." She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and the warm air rushed out to meet them, thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed wool. The murmur of conversation died as every head turned toward the doorway. Martha felt the weight of their stares, some curious, some pitying, most dismissive. She recognized the faces. Mayor Hutchinson with his carefully waxed mustache, banker William Thorne in his pressed suit, the influential ranchers and business owners who controlled the economic heartbeat of Millfield. "Well, I'll be," drawled Cyrus Mackenzie, the largest landowner in the county, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Looks like we got ourselves some unexpected visitors." A ripple of chuckles followed his words. Martha's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high as she guided her children to an empty bench near the back. The wooden seat creaked under their combined weight, and she noticed how Emma shrank against her side when the laughter grew louder. Mayor Hutchinson rapped his gavel against the podium. "Now, folks, let's settle down. We're here to discuss serious business tonight." His eyes found Martha's across the room. "Though I'm not sure what brings Mrs. Calloway, isn't it? What brings you here tonight? This is a meeting about land development and the future of our town." Martha stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her worn skirt. "I have children to feed and a future to consider, same as anyone else here. I figure that gives me the right to listen." Banker Thorne leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "With respect, ma'am, but this discussion involves significant financial investments and business partnerships. Perhaps there's somewhere else you'd be more comfortable." "She's comfortable right where she is," came a voice from the middle of the room. Martha turned to see Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, fixing Thorne with a steady gaze. "Last I checked, this was a public meeting." The banker's face reddened. "Of course, doctor. I simply meant—" "We all know what you meant," Dr. Hayes interrupted, and Martha felt a flush of gratitude toward the soft-spoken man who had delivered little James and seen her through the worst fever of her life 2 winters past. Mayor Hutchinson cleared his throat loudly. "If we could return to the matter at hand, as I was saying before this interruption, we're here to discuss the proposed partnership between the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and our local business consortium. The railroad is interested in establishing a major depot here in Millfield, which would bring unprecedented prosperity to our community." Martha listened as the mayor outlined the grand plans. Hotels for traveling businessmen, shops to serve the increased population, warehouses for goods traveling east and west. It sounded like a dream, the kind of future that could lift a struggling family out of poverty. But as the details emerged, her heart began to sink. "The railroad has expressed particular interest in the Thompson Valley," Mayor Hutchinson continued, "which offers the flattest terrain and the most direct route through the mountains. Of course, this would require the acquisition of certain underutilized properties in that area." Rancher Pete Morrison stood up, his silver beard gleaming in the lamplight. "You talking about forcing people off their land, Mayor?" "Not forcing, certainly not," Hutchinson said quickly. "The railroad company is prepared to offer fair compensation for any properties they need, far more generous than current market value, I'm assured." Cyrus Mackenzie chuckled. "Fair compensation for what? Half those places in Thompson Valley are barely more than homesteads, some fool settlers trying to scratch a living out of land that's better suited for grazing. Hell, most of them will be doing themselves a favor taking the railroad's money and heading back east where they belong. More laughter rippled through the room, and Martha felt her children press closer to her. She knew they were talking about places like hers, the small homesteads scattered throughout Thompson Valley, worked by families who had come west with dreams bigger than their bank accounts. "What about the widow Henderson?" asked Mrs. Sullivan, the mercantile owner's wife. "Poor woman's been trying to work that patch of land since her husband died. Might be a blessing if someone offered to buy her out. And that Calloway place," added Banker Thorne, not bothering to lower his voice, "been falling apart since her husband passed. Can't imagine she's making much of a living off that rocky ground." The mention of her name sent heat flooding through Martha's cheeks. She could feel every eye in the room turning toward her again, some with pity, others with barely concealed disdain. Sarah's hand found hers and squeezed tight. "Poor thing," whispered Mrs. Abbott, the schoolteacher, though not quietly enough. "4 children and no proper way to support them. Probably blessing in disguise if the railroad wants to buy her out. She could take that money and find herself a nice little place in town, maybe take in sewing or washing. If she's lucky," Mackenzie said with a laugh, "though I hear tell she's already behind on her property taxes. Might not have much choice in the matter soon enough." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She knew people talked in a town the size of Millfield. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but hearing her struggles discussed so casually, so callously in front of her children made her stomach churn with humiliation and rage. Mayor Hutchinson consulted his papers. According to the railroad surveyor, they would need to acquire approximately 12 properties in Thompson Valley to complete their planned route. Most are small homesteads of minimal value. The total compensation budget allocated for land acquisition is quite generous, should be more than sufficient to relocate any affected families. "How generous are we talking?" asked Thorne, leaning forward with interest. "The railroad company has authorized up to $3,000 for the entire Thompson Valley acquisition," the mayor announced. Martha's mouth went dry. $3,000 divided among 12 families would leave each with perhaps $250, enough to survive for a few months, maybe buy passage back east, but nowhere near enough to start over with any real security. "That seems reasonable," nodded Mackenzie. "More than reasonable for land that's barely productive. Most of those homesteaders would jump at the chance. What if they don't want to sell?" Dr. Hayes asked quietly. The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Banker Thorne spoke up. "Well, doctor, sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. The needs of the many outweigh the desires of a few stubborn individuals. Besides, most of these people are barely hanging on as it is. We'd essentially be doing them a favor." Martha felt something crack inside her chest. The casual way they discussed uprooting families, destroying the lives people had built with their own hands, treating human beings like obstacles to be cleared away, it ignited something fierce and bright in her soul. She stood up again, this time with purpose. "And what makes you so certain we want your favors?" The room fell silent. Mayor Hutchinson's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Calloway. You've been sitting here for the better part of an hour discussing our lives like we're not even human beings," Martha said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "talking about our homes like they're nothing more than inconveniences. Well, maybe some of us don't want your railroad money, maybe some of us built something worth keeping." Mackenzie let out a bark of laughter. "Built something? Lady, I've seen your place. You got about 40 acres of the rockiest, most stubborn ground in the valley, a cabin that's half falling down, and a barn that wouldn't shelter a goat in a rainstorm. What exactly have you built that's worth keeping?" The laughter that followed felt like needles against Martha's skin. She heard Emma sniffle behind her and felt Thomas's small hand slip into hers. But instead of shame, she felt a cold, clear fury settle over her like armor. "You want to know what I've built?" she asked, reaching into the leather satchel she'd carried with her. "I've built a legacy." Her fingers found the document she'd kept wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time. She'd carried it with her today, not because she'd planned to use it, but because it was too precious to leave behind in their emptied cabin. "My husband William didn't die leaving us with nothing," she continued, pulling out the papers. "He left us with something these railroad men want very badly, and something none of you seem to understand the value of." She unfolded the document, her hands steady now despite the tremor in her voice. "You see, Mr. Mackenzie, you've been assuming that my 40 acres are worthless, but what you don't know, what none of you know, is that my 40 acres sit right on top of the Thompson Valley Aquifer, the same aquifer that feeds every well and stream for 20 miles in any direction." The laughter died abruptly.
Martha saw Mayor Hutchinson's face go pale. Furthermore, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, my 40 acres happen to control the only natural pass through Devil's Canyon, the same pass your precious railroad would need to reach the mineral deposits in the high country. She held up the document so everyone could see the official seals and signatures. This isn't just a homestead deed, gentlemen. This is a mining claim, properly filed and legally binding, covering mineral and water rights for the entire Thompson Valley watershed. My husband spent 2 years researching property law and territorial regulations before he filed this claim. He was many things, but he wasn't a fool. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Martha could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every stare in the room. Banker Thorne was the first to speak, his voice strangled. That's impossible. Those claims were supposed to be filed through the territorial office in Denver. We would have known William filed this claim in 1882, before the Denver office was established, Martha said calmly. It was properly witnessed, properly recorded, and properly maintained. Every year since his death, I've paid the required fees to keep it active. She paused, letting that sink in. The same fees I've been struggling to pay by selling eggs and taking in washing, while you all pitied the poor widow who couldn't make ends meet. Dr. Hayes stood up slowly. Martha, are you saying you own the water rights to the entire valley? According to territorial law, whoever controls the primary aquifer access controls water rights for the entire watershed, she confirmed. And the mining claim gives me mineral rights for everything within a 5-mile radius of the original strike point. Mayor Hutchinson's face had gone from pale to green. The mineral rights that would include the silver deposits the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad is really after, Martha finished. Yes, Mr. Mayor, it would include those. The room erupted. Men jumped to their feet, voices raised in argument and disbelief. Banker Thorne was frantically shuffling through papers on his desk, as if hoping to find some document that would contradict what Martha had just revealed. Mayor Hutchinson's face had gone ashen, and she could see him calculating the political ramifications of this revelation. The railroad deal that was supposed to secure his re-election had just become infinitely more complicated. Through the chaos, Martha heard fragments. How could we not know? This changes everything. That claim can't be legal. We need to see those documents. Get Morrison over here. Someone needs to verify this. Mrs. Sullivan clutched her husband's arm, whispering urgently about what this might mean for their mercantile business, while Dr. Hayes sat back in his chair with what looked suspiciously like a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Abbott, was staring at Martha with newfound respect, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. But above it all, she heard Cyrus Mackenzie's voice, no longer filled with lazy amusement but sharp with anger and something that might have been fear. Even if that's all true, you're still just one woman with 4 children. You think you can develop mining operations? You think you can stand up to railroad lawyers and territorial politicians? You're in over your head, lady. Martha looked around the room at the faces of the men who had dismissed her, who had spoken about her family like unwanted baggage, who had planned to force them from their home for pocket change. Then she looked down at her children, Sarah standing tall and proud beside her, Thomas with his jaw set in determination, Emma no longer crying but watching with wide wondering eyes, and little James who didn't understand everything but knew his mama was fighting for them. You might be right, Mr. Mackenzie, she said quietly. I might be in over my head, but I'll tell you what I'm not. I'm not homeless, I'm not powerless, and I'm not going anywhere. She folded the deed carefully and placed it back in her satchel. This meeting was called to discuss the future of our valley. Well, gentlemen, I am the future of this valley. Every drop of water you drink, every mining operation you want to establish, every railroad track you want to lay through Devil's Canyon, it all goes through me now. The room had gone dead silent again. Martha could see the wheels turning in their heads, the rapid calculations of men who had built their fortunes on understanding power and leverage. She had just shifted the entire balance of power in Thompson Valley, and they all knew it. What do you want? Banker Thorne asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha smiled for the first time since entering the room. What I want, Mr. Thorne, is respect. What I want is a seat at the table when decisions are made about our community. What I want is a future for my children that doesn't depend on your charity or your pity. She stood and gathered her children around her. What I want is partnership, not patronization. The railroad can have their depot, and you can have your development, but it's going to be done fairly, with consideration for all the families in this valley, not just the ones with the biggest bank accounts. As she turned to leave, Dr. Hayes spoke up. Martha, wait, if you're serious about partnership, perhaps we should talk about forming a proper development committee, one with broader representation. She paused at the door and looked back. I'd be very interested in that conversation, Doctor. Very interested indeed. Outside, the October wind felt different against her face, sharper, cleaner, full of possibility instead of desperation. Her children walked closer to her, but not from fear this time. From pride. She could hear Thomas asking Sarah in hushed, excited tones about what mining claims meant, while Emma clutched her rag doll and looked back at the town hall with wide eyes, as if unable to believe her quiet mama had just silenced a room full of the most important men in Millfield. "Mama," Sarah said softly, "I had no idea Papa left us all that." Martha smiled, thinking of William and his quiet determination to protect his family even beyond death. She remembered the long nights he had spent poring over territorial law books borrowed from the county clerk, making careful notes by candlelight while she mended clothes and the children slept. He had been so secretive about his research, telling her only that he was making sure the family would be provided for, words she had assumed meant he was planning to expand their farming operation or perhaps invest in livestock. "Your father was always planning for the future, honey. He just wanted to make sure we'd have one." As they reached their wagon, Martha noticed several men emerging from the town hall, their urgent voices carrying across the square. She could see Mayor Hutchinson gesticulating wildly as he spoke with two men she didn't recognize, probably representatives from the railroad company who had been waiting outside during the meeting. Their neat suits and polished shoes marked them as outsiders, and from their animated discussion she could tell word of her revelation was already spreading. "Mrs. Calloway," came a voice behind them. She turned to see Dr. Hayes jogging across the square, his medical bag bouncing at his side. "Mrs. Calloway, wait just a moment if you would." She waited as he approached, slightly out of breath. "Doctor, I wanted to say, that took considerable courage in there," he said, glancing back toward the town hall where shadowy figures could still be seen arguing through the windows. "But Mackenzie wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. You're going to need help. Legal help, political help, financial help. These men don't like to lose, and they especially don't like to lose to someone they've underestimated." Martha nodded slowly. She had known even as she spoke that tonight was only the beginning of a much larger battle. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm suggesting that you're not as alone as you might think. There are people in this town who've grown tired of watching Mackenzie and his cronies run everything for their own benefit. People who believe progress shouldn't come at the expense of working families." He paused, looking at her children. "I'm suggesting that tomorrow morning you might want to pay a visit to Judge Crawford's office. He's an honest man and he knows territorial law better than anyone in 3 counties. You're going to want those claims properly verified and protected before word reaches Denver." As they walked toward their wagon, Martha could hear the heated discussions resuming inside the town hall. Let them argue and scheme and posture all they wanted. She had work to do, a valley to develop, a railroad to negotiate with, and 4 children to raise who would never again have to listen to anyone speak about their family with anything less than respect. The deed in her satchel felt heavier now, weighted with possibility and power. Tomorrow she would start the real work of building the future William had dreamed of. She would visit Judge Crawford, as Dr. Hayes suggested, and she would begin the careful process of transforming legal documents into real security for her family. She would learn about mining operations and water rights, about railroad negotiations and territorial politics. She would become the kind of woman who could sit at tables with men like Mackenzie and speak as an equal, not as a supplicant. But tonight she would simply enjoy the feeling of walking away from that room with her head held high, knowing that she had just changed the course of Thompson Valley forever. Tonight she would tuck her children into their bedrolls in the back of the wagon, their temporary home until she could reclaim their cabin and tell them stories about their father's foresight and their own bright future. As little James tugged at her skirt and asked if they could go home now, Martha lifted him into her arms and looked back one last time at the town hall where lamplight still flickered behind angry voices. "We are going home, sweetheart," she whispered into his hair. "We're going home to our valley where we belong, and this time we're never leaving again." Behind them, through the windows of the town hall, the shadows of arguing men danced on the walls, but Martha Calloway and her 4 children walked steadily into the darkness, toward a future that was finally, truly their own. The widow who had entered that room as a figure of pity had emerged as the most powerful person in Thompson Valley, and she was just getting started.